So Karla grew up on a farm in Georgia. She's currently the communications consultant that supports the Plant Protection Division at WSDA, and that's our pest program is within the Plant Protection Division. She moonlights as an enthusiastic bee atlas volunteer. In 2025 alone, last year she netted over 3,000 wild bees for science throughout Washington. Karla is also one of only 3 people in Washington state to have earned their journey level certification with the National Master Melittologist program through Oregon State University. She is an OSU Master Melittologist field and microscope instructor and is currently working on her master level certification and developing a key to identify Pacific Northwest digger bees. So she's going to tell us all about that.
I remember to unmute myself. Good morning, everyone. I am super excited to talk to you about my latest passion, which is native bees and working with the Washington Bee Atlas. And I've kicked off our first slide here with one of my favorite bees. It's called Anthophora crotchii. And I mean, how can you not love that face, that red hair? I'm hoping by the end of this presentation that you will have a little bit more knowledge about native bees, and maybe you won't love them quite to the extent that I do, but have a better appreciation for them and what they're doing on your farms. So first off, what are native or wild bees? Basically, we're talking about, at least for purposes of this talk, anything except the honeybee. If you are not aware, Apis mellifera, the honeybee that's in North America, is introduced. It's not a native bee. The Europeans brought it over initially for wax and honey, and that's how it got here, basically. And now it's widespread, not only through North America, but much of the world, for its honey and wax production, as well as the pollination services that it provides. But we're talking about today is everything else. And in Washington state, there are at least about 600 different species of bees within our state, and we're learning more about those. So what do some of these bees look like? Have you ever seen them? So here's our first one. Here's one. This is honestly just a bee eye candy in my, that's Anthophora crotchii again, the one that was on the very first slide. I just had to start this presentation off with just some very cool pictures of bees that we have to give you an idea of some of the diversity of what we have right here in Washington. And as well as I know we have Idaho and Oregon as well. And many of these bees are found in those states. And Oregon, in fact, to my knowledge, has even more bees than Washington. This is one of my favorites. It's a plaster bee, it's a hylaeus, and look at those antennae. I mean, that's crazy. So we have many genera of bees within Washington state, including the honeybee, as you see that popped up there. And many of these are likely already on your farms, in your garden, but most people just are not aware of them. Some of them, in fact, are so small that most people think that they're just a gnat or some other little insect flying around. Here we have in this slide a comparison of one of the smallest bees as well as one of the largest bees. And you can see that the small bee just fits on the head of the large bee. So you can imagine how tiny that is. They can be as small as about 2 millimeters long. So we have some really, really tiny bees that most people just overlook and don't realize that they're even in their yards. You're not going to miss that carpenter bee, though. That's huge. And actually newly introduced into Washington state. And this is on the East Coast. Normally where they're found. So here are some native bee basics. 90% of them are solitary, which means that you have a female that builds her own nest and she provisions her own nest. There aren't workers like in a honeybee colony, which is a social colony. So a social colony will have the queen, the workers, and the drones. In a solitary colony, there's just the queen. Well, I guess you call it a queen, but every female is a queen because they're creating their own nest. What they do is basically one cell at a time. They will go out, collect pollen, provision that cell, lay an egg with the pollen and nectar, whatever's in there, and then seal off that cell and then start again until the end of their life cycle, whatever that may be. And 70% nest in the ground. So this is also unlike honeybees, which usually are cavity nesters. At least Apis mellifera is a cavity nester, which means it's going to go inside some other hole. Most of the native bees are actually nesting in the ground. They could be anywhere from just a couple of inches down into the ground to, I think I've seen as much as like 3 or 4 feet deep into the ground that they will actually tunnel down. Another difference between native bees and honeybees is that the adults are only active for a few weeks normally. So this means the native bees that are on your farm or in the landscape are constantly changing throughout the season. They're usually sort of synced with preferred host plants if they have a preferred host plant. So if you only see a certain host plant at one time of the year, there may be bees that you will only see at that time of the year. So usually native bees are only active for, a few weeks, basically out on the landscape. The rest of the time they're in their nest, whether that's underground or the ones that are not in the ground are also sort of a cavity nester. They nest in like twigs in holes that they find in rodent burrows. Well, I guess that's underground, but you get my point. So the rest of their life is spent in the dark whenever they're not out and about. There are some native bees that are generalists that are present over an extended season, but a lot of them are just present for a few weeks. So I'm going to be throwing around some terms during this presentation. Just wanted to talk about what these mean. So a managed bee is going to be something where there's some sort of human intervention. They're not just out in the wild on their own, doing their own thing. So honeybees, when you have a honeybee hive, that would be a managed bee where there's human intervention in maintaining that colony. A wild bee would be the opposite of being just out on their own, doing their own thing. We're not really doing anything to help them unless, you're leaving hollow twigs around or something like that they might just be using on their own. Another couple of pair of terms is introduced. So these would be bees that are not native to this area. A honeybee would be introduced because it's not native to the Pacific Northwest. And then native, these are ones that are, have been here, have always been here, as, at least as far as we can tell by our scientific methods. So just to kind of show you how these interact, a managed introduced bee would be the honeybee. There's also the alfalfa leafcutter bee, common eastern bumblebee. We'll go into some of these in a little bit more detail a little bit later. A managed native bee would be the alkali bee, as well as some mason bees. A lot of people have mason bees in their yards that they're using to help pollinate their trees, etc. There's a wild introduced, and this would be something that's been introduced but is not, nobody's managing it. So examples of this is the European wool carder bee, the oblong wool carder bee, and both of those look similar to what's in that photo up there. And then all managed bees. Because even though we may be managing honeybees, for example, we all know about the issue of honeybees swarming or finding swarms, in our tree where there's a big clump of honeybees all around a queen. A lot of times our managed bees end up becoming wild bees, at least some of them. And then you've got your wild native bees, and there's about 600 in Washington. I can't remember the numbers for Oregon at this point. I know it's over 700 in Oregon that have been documented. It might be over 800, I'm not sure. But there's a lot. Okay, So let's talk a little bit about native bees and crop pollination. So first off, I mean, why would you even want to consider native bees for crop pollination when you have honeybees that are traditionally used for making sure that your crops get pollinated? First off, the Pacific Northwest is specialty crop rich. So we have a huge number of specialty crops. Basically, what I'm talking about in this context is non-grains. I know that's not the technical definition, but if all that you have is large fields of wheat or corn, like it's very common, especially in the Midwest, bee pollination is not as important because all of that is done primarily through wind pollination. But in Washington State, we have over 300 different types of crops, and a huge number of those are specialty crops, and they require pollination. So this is a great state to really consider how are we achieving pollination on our farms and gardens. Another great reason for native bees is that they're adapted to our climate. So they will go out and forage, for example. Mason bees are a great example. They're an early spring bee, the Osmia lignaria, which is the blue orchard mason bee. It's an early spring bee. It is flying in colder weather than honeybees will fly in. And so they're just more adapted to our climate here locally because they're native to this area. Native bees, another plus, they are generally not aggressive. So social bees and wasps are the ones that are more aggressive. They have a larger colony that they are defending, protecting, and growing. They will more aggressively defend their colony than native bees. Plus, on the social level, if they lose workers, that doesn't end the colony. Whereas with native bees, if there's just the one, queen or one female who is creating the nest, if she dies, she is, that's the end of the nest. There's not going to be any more creating new little bees. So they're less likely to sting you. On the other hand, they can also sting you multiple times, which is not exactly a plus, but they're, from personal experience, I've been stung many times now. They do not sting unless, they're feeling threatened. And when I'm catching them in a net that qualifies as being threatened. But their stings, with the exception of bumblebees, those do hurt. The stings from the native bees I have found do not hurt as much as a honeybee sting. Many times they're less management intensive than honeybees. So for the most part, you're just letting them do their thing, other than helping provide some habitat for them to make sure that they are thriving on your land. There are some managed native bees, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And the last reason I want to talk about is that honeybees won't pollinate all crops, in particular legumes. So your beans, peas, chickpeas, that kind of thing. They have different types of flowers. I'm going to show a video of this in a little bit, but honeybees will not pollinate that type of flower. So they will get nectar from those flowers. They kind of like steal it basically, but it's not creating the pollination that you need if you're trying to achieve, fruit set. So let's talk about those. Let's do a little video and show you how those flowers work that I was just mentioning.
But pollinating alfalfa flowers is a lot trickier than it looks. Even honeybees can't really hack it. Here's why. Alfalfa keeps its pollen locked away inside its flowers. To get it, the bees have to step on a spring-loaded petal called a keel petal. Here's how it works. Pop! It releases this column that has the pollen at the end. It's called tripping the flower. Here it is again. The column has some force. The bee might get a good thwack in the face. Leaf-cutting bees just don't care. They can take a punch. Pop. Pop. Honey honeybees don't really like to tangle with that. They'll usually step around gingerly, trying to sip nectar from the side without setting it off.
Okay, so you saw how those flowers work, and one thing they did not mention in the there we go. One thing they didn't mention in the video is that sometimes honeybees will actually, and other bees that don't like getting, whacked in the face by the flower, will even sometimes like bite holes in the sides of the flower to like steal the nectar without actually getting whacked in the face by that column. So honeybees are not going to pollinate everything that you're looking for. Also, native bees are already pollinating on your farm a lot. They used to think that native bees were contributing maybe like up to 10% pollination, but a lot of more recent studies have shown that wild bees visits are on par with honeybee visits in fields, and in some cases, especially maybe even more important than honeybees for pollination. There's also been some Eastern US studies that there's more wild bee visits to flowers even when honeybees are present. And another reason is that they have found that pollinator diversity, meaning the different species of bees or other pollinators that you have, animal pollinators visiting your flowers, the better pollination you're going to have. You're going to have better fruit and seed set. They think because different pollinators are working the flowers in different ways, and this is resulting in better pollination overall. So let's talk about some of these bees that we're using in pollination already. We mentioned the leafcutter bee. We just saw the example of that video of that bee in action. And this is a photo that I took of a field here in Washington State of one of these sort of, you might call it not a bee house, but a bee, I don't know, condominium, super complex hotel, housing a lot of bees. And you'll see a few of these throughout the fields. And the bees will go out and pollinate. This is an alfalfa field, looks like. Pollinate the alfalfa plants and then come back and lay their eggs and expand their numbers that way in that sort of bee hotel. Pro tip, they will not only go in that bee hotel. So if this is on your property, you could find these bees everywhere. And I grew up on the farm, as I mentioned, in Eastern Washington and George. And my dad had some of these leafcutter bees on his property 2 years ago. And last year, when I was out and there were no, brought in managed leafcutter bees, there were a ton of alfalfa leafcutter bees in my mom's garden. So they don't just stay in that little hotel. Another example of managed bees is Bombus impatiens, which is has been used in greenhouse pollination efforts. Bumblebees do something that's called buzz pollination, where there are certain flowers like tomatoes where the flower has to basically be vibrated to release its pollen. And honeybees cannot do that, so they cannot pollinate tomatoes, for example. But bumblebees and some other types of native bees can. So there have been bumblebees used in greenhouse production. And again, this is one of those bees that I mentioned, the managed bees get out. They were intended not to get out, but they did. And so there was some Canadian greenhouse operations that were using Bombus impatiens, which is not native to the Pacific Northwest. It's native to the East Coast. And it has escaped and is now, it was in Canada, and now it's making its way down into Washington State. I know there are many documented incidents of it in Whatcom County, for example. And one of the projects that WSDA is working on is trying to not eradicate it, but to determine what the impact is of this introduced bee on our native bumblebee populations. Because as I know a lot of people know, some of our bumblebees here are struggling. So they're trying to figure out if Bombus impatiens is going to have an impact on the ability for our native bees to survive. Another bee that many people are familiar with and a lot of people have started using are mason bees. This is oftentimes homeowners, but also there's orchards that are using these bees as well. As I mentioned, they can fly in cooler weather. Um, they also show a higher preference for apple blossoms compared to honeybees. So there's a lot of use for them potentially in apple orchards as well. And then probably the most unusual managed native bee in Washington state is the alkali bee. And this is the only managed bee that I know of that is ground nesting. So all of the other managed bees, and I didn't mention honeybees, of course, because they're not native, but all of these other ones, you have a way of moving and containing their colonies. um, the alkali bee is in the ground. So what they are doing is managing the ground to help these bees thrive in especially the Walla Walla area for alfalfa seed production. And I think I have a video.
Busy as a bee, just as we keep on the go, bees are saying game on to keeping our crops pollinated. Tomas is over in the Walla Walla Valley at Wagner Farms to see their importance to one crop in particular.
The Walla Walla Valley produces some incredible wine and delicious sweet onions. But what some people might not know is that it's one of the leaders of alfalfa seed production in the world. And the main reason for this is the local alkali bees. While we are all familiar with the honeybees and how they play an integral role in crop pollination, they will not pollinate alfalfa seed. However, an alkali bee will. So I met up with second-generation farmer Mark Wagner to find out why.
Alfalfa has to be pollinated to get seed. The flowers, they physically have to be tripped to open up the stamen where the pollen is. And honeybees won't do that. They don't like to open up the stamen because it hits them in the face. That's what the entomologists tell us. Right. And so they just go in by the side and they take the nectar out of the plants. The Washington State University scientists figured out in the 1950s that alkali bees, that are native to this valley, loved pollinating the alfalfa.
As we were talking, I could see several bees in the air, but I wanted to get a closer look. So I asked Mark if he could take me to one of the bee beds.
So this is what I'm hearing.
Now these bees, yep.
Look, I mean, they're literally just popping out of the ground here.
They live about 4 to 6 inches underground, and only the female bees dig the holes. The male bees kind of got it made. All they do is fly around, eat nectar, and pollinate the females.
Besides their work ethic, I asked Mark if there are any other differences between the male and female bees.
Well, number one, the males don't have stingers, and the females have little bitty stingers, but they're not aggressive. They don't. The only time I've ever got stung by one of them is if they crawl in my shirt and trying to get out or something like that. But mostly you can walk across here and they won't bother you at all. They ignore you. What they want is flowers.
I asked Mark if it's hard to balance what's being applied to the alfalfa seed to control weeds and pests without affecting the plant or the bees.
One of the biggest factors we have is killing the bad insects that attack the alfalfa. You can't grow alfalfa seed organically in the Walla Walla Valley. The insect pests will just eat it all up. A couple of years ago, a WSU entomologist got us a chemical register called bee leaf that will kill the lygus bugs and aphids, and it won't kill the bees at all. But that's some of the newer things we're seeing coming down as far as technologies, new insecticides that are safer for the bees but still kill the pests.
What would you like people to know?
What I would like most people to know is that we try to protect them. We try to make places for them to live. We're very careful when we spray insecticides that we don't kill them. You know, a lot of people think farmers just go indiscriminately go out there and spray. Well, they're our livelihood, so they're like our family almost. I want people to know that we protect them.
So tell me how long you've been doing this.
So I've been farming since 1975, full time. Yep.
Nice. So it's a family farm, so are you hoping to continue it on?
Yeah, my grandpa farmed, then my dad, now me. My son graduated from WSU in 2005, so he's here with his wife, and he just had a little baby boy who's 18 months old. And that kid just loves tractors. He likes to drive the toy tractor. He likes to ride on the big tractor. So yeah, hopefully we'll have another generation, 2 generations after me, keep taking care of the alkali bees. Yep, take care of the farm.
Well, I am very excited that you showed this to us. Very cool, and I thank you so much for all your hard work that you do.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Busy as a bee, just as we keep.
So let me go back. I just want to show you again this picture, which is a little bit small here. I wish I would have made it bigger, but I just have to share this because it's cool. These bees are gorgeous. it's a little bit hard to tell in this striping, but the stripes are basically like iridescent and kind of rainbowish. And it's the only bee in Washington State that's like that, that I know of. And I wish I'd taken a photo of this guy's legs because they have crazy weird legs too. The males do. But that's, if you get to my level of
Busy
bee
as a bee,
nuttiness,
just as we
let's
keep
move on. There we go. Okay. So let's talk about some of the wild bees that are not managed bees, but what you might find on your farm. So I'm going to start with generalists, and generalists are bees that kind of forage on just about anything, maybe not everything, but you'll see them foraging on a lot of different genera of plants. So the first one we have here today, and I just want to give a shout out. We've got some really great bee photographers out there, especially on iNaturalist, which I'll cover later. But like one of them, for example, here is Lisa Hill, and they take great, stunning photos of bees, and they also allow them to be used. So I really appreciate all of those photographers out there. So the green bee is Agapostemon, and out of all of the bees that some people might recognize besides a honeybee and a bumblebee, this is probably maybe the third most recognizable bee I think that people see. And it's because of that distinct green color that they have. That's it's a really flashy, pretty green. Up in the upper right corner is Lasia glossum, and it's also kind of a green, but not such a flashy green. So you might not even notice that that it is green. It might look black, because if you're looking, we're pretty zoomed in on this plant. You can see how large that one bee looks, but the Lasia glossum, especially that's in subgenus Dialectus, it is very small. They're usually only a few millimeters long, and so that's one of those that I mentioned earlier that kind of can get confused for gnats. Halictus is also a very common bee that you'll see out in farms and gardens. I just want to say as a side note too, bees are super hard to identify from photographs. And so you might be able to tell what genus it is, like we can tell. Actually, I can tell what species this is too, but most of the time from photographs, you can't tell what bee you're looking at to species level at least. And sometimes it's even hard to get to the genus because you'll have bees that look completely different that are in totally different, bees that look very, very similar, but are in totally different families even. So bee identification is hard. If you can't identify the bees, that's cool. My goal here is just to get you an idea of what they look like. And so you can get a better familiarity about whether these are on your farm or not. So this is another photo by Lisa Hill, Halictus, and this is, I believe, Halictus farinosus, probably, most likely, the wide-striped sweat bee, another generalist. Here is a type of osmia that we haven't seen before. Mason and leafcutter bees are generally generalists. And this is one that's an early spring bee. This is Osmia lignaria, and it's a brilliant blue bee with also that red hair, so it's like super cool. And as you can see, this one too has learned how to use those, because this is in the legume family, this plant has learned how to trip that flower and get in there and get that nectar and pollen. Here's a Megachile. This is our native leafcutter bee, one of the many actually, but probably the most common, the western leafcutter bee. I don't know that is necessarily used in managed bees. Usually the managed bees are the alfalfa leafcutter bee, which is Megachile rotundata. And this is Megachile perihirta. And one of the cool things about this, I love, there's a certain subgenus of these bees that have, you can see the foreleg there, that's kind of orangish with white. And I'm pointing with my finger instead of my mouse. Yeah, the sort of orangish leg with this white part on the front, and then these long brushes on their forelegs, which is, I think, really cool. And then we have Anthidium, and I'm just giving some examples. We have a lot more than what I'm sharing here, but just to give people an idea of what is out there. This is a native Anthidium as well. They're also generally generalists. And now we're hitting the digger bees and bumblebees. This is Anthophora. This one is Anthophora albata, one of my favorite bees. And if you look, it has I call it Anthophora crazy legs albata because it has really crazy legs. This is a specimen that I collected. If you look here, it has not only that really cool yellow face, which a lot of male native bees have, but it has these forelegs that are kind of red, and then you don't see it too clearly in this, but it has sort of like alternating white and black patches on its forelegs here. And then check out this middle leg. It's like a triangle here, basically, with a really long mid-tibial spur there. That's incredibly long. Most, if you look back here, that is more normal, a tibial spur that looks like that. So having this long curved thing is really unusual. And then look at that crazy middle long leg. I mean, it's ridiculously long. And then the hind leg too has special shapes and colors, and I don't know, it's crazy. But they are generalist bees, generally speaking. I would say most of them are more toward the spring, although we do have some that are present basically all year long, and a little bit later and well into the fall. Eucera are also a very cool bee. I couldn't even get the antenna entirely on this shot because they are so long, and they're aptly named the longhorn bees. And they have the males, actually, not the females, have these really, really long antennae. And then we're all familiar, I think, with bumblebees. This happens to be Bombus occidentalis, the western bumblebee, which has been in decline for many years. And is found on both sides of the state, which is really interesting. I actually was shocked to find one in my own yard here a couple of years ago. So hopefully they are rebounding, but they're on the species of greatest conservation need list for Washington State. We also have mining bees, and you'll find that these sort of like general terms, especially for the families, are not very creative because so many of them nest in the ground. You've got your digger bees, your miner bees, your furrow bees, all referencing the fact that they nest in the ground. So here's another family, the mining bees, Andrenidae rather, and Andrena is what this bee is here. And then you have Panerginus, which is a much smaller bee. You can tell by the size of the berry flower that these two are pollinating in, but also in that family. So next we're going to talk about some specialists. And why am I talking about this? We'll get to this in a little bit, but in order to support bees, you need to know what they eat. And so one of the things I'm talking about here is, whether they are generalists or specialists. And so we have Melittologist, which is also a longhorn bee. As you can see, this is another male in my mom's yard in George there. It doesn't have as long of antenna as the Eucera does, but it has pretty long antenna, and they specialize, as the photo might suggest, on sunflowers. Plants in the sunflower family, I guess I should say. Melittologist, which used to be called Svastra, is another bee that specializes on sunflowers, and you'll find a lot of bees specialize on sunflowers, which is interesting because the sunflower family actually has some things that make the pollen difficult to digest. But I guess if you can, or I guess I should say use, but if you can, crack that nut, a lot of bees have become specialists on the aster family. So this is another one. This is actually kind of I would say it's an uncommon bee, Melittologist, unless you're in my mom's yard. And I've seen several there. This is a female, and one of the ways you can tell females from males is that females, for the most part, again, there are exceptions, will have these long hairs either on their legs, like this one does, or in the Megachile family, it will be on the abdomen, on the underside of the abdomen. And then this is Caliopsis, another uncommon bee in my mom's yard. I like visiting my mom's yard. She's got a lot of great bees in there. Another specialist, I'm struggling. I think they may vary on what exact genera they specialize on, but I think aster is also one of them. And then Perdita, which is one of our smallest bees. They're very tiny and kind of flat. It's a little bit weird, especially their abdomen. You can probably kind of tell here. It looks, they're really flat, and it's one of our teeny tiniest little bees. Okay, I think I'm doing okay on time. I better speed up just a little bit. I wanted to bring up a couple of case studies to talk about how studies that have actually been done on bees on agricultural lands. So in New York, they did a study and they found 120 bee species in central Washington, New York apple orchards, just in the central Washington, central New York apple orchards, just in those areas alone, just in the apple orchards, or nearby, right beside the apple orchards, not counting anything else. That's a pretty astounding number. They also found that compared to honeybees, wild bees they're better pollinators on a per visit basis, meaning, if you have one honeybee visit and one native bee visit, you're going to get better pollination from that native bee visit. The reason why honeybees are successful in our crops is because they overwhelm the flowers. So you just have so many of them. And again, I do want to put a little caveat here. This talk is not to diss honeybees at all. They're, an important part of agriculture, and they produce their own commodities with honey and wax. So this is not to diss on honeybees, but to address those issues of, honeybees are struggling. They're having some struggles. And so where else can we get our pollination? And this is one of those possibilities. So going back to this, they also carried more compatible fruit pollen. The wild bees carried more compatible fruit pollen to facilitate pollination, and they transferred pollen at a higher rate. They yielded higher fruit set per visit. Again, we mentioned already, they forage in more inclement weather, and they show a stronger preference for apple blossoms than the honeybees did. They found that the wild bee abundance and diversity increased the seed set for apples. And even, we're not talking about diversity with honeybees because it's just the honeybee, but even with like greater numbers of honeybees, they did not see that correlation of increased seed set with the apples. So the native bees were out there doing a great job and having some really good results. Another case study, it was in blueberries, and this was on 15 Michigan farms. They found 166 wild bee species in or near the blueberry fields, 30 different genera, and 112 of those were active during blueberry flowering. Now, blueberries are another one of those crops that it takes a special pollinator that knows how to get that pollen out to make the pollination happen. So that can be a bumblebee, as you're seeing in this photo, or as we're going to talk about next. And this would not be in Michigan, so I want to be clear, this is not from the Michigan study, but just a separate note on this particular bee. An example of a specialist bee, which has a narrow host association with its plant, is the blueberry digger bee, or the southern blueberry digger bee, Habropoda laboriosa. It's a narrow specialist. It says that they're only on the blueberry family, although based on the INET records I've seen lately, I think that might need to be revised because I've definitely seen them on things that are not the blueberry family, but they may depend on the blueberry family for their life cycle. They may need that particular pollen, so I would need to research that a little bit more. But they're extremely efficient at pollination. They remove up to 70% of pollen in a single visit from that flower. So they're doing massive pollen transfer. And the way they do it is oftentimes you'll see both with bumblebees and with Habropoda or Anthophora, the bee will sort of be hanging onto the flower underneath it. And what they do is they kind of unhinge in a way their wings and then vibrate their muscles and shake that pollen out onto their body where they kind of collect it, and then they will groom it onto their legs for carrying it around and then eventually back to the nest. And also, if you've ever been around Habropoda or Anthophora, these bees are fast. They're really fast, and from somebody trying to catch them, really hard to catch because they are so fast. Even if you're just trying to take a photo of them, it's very difficult because of this efficiency that they have. Their visits only took 2.6 seconds to pollinate that flower and get up to 70% of the pollen before they zoomed off to the next flower. And for bumblebees, that takes about 7.4 seconds to do the same work. So if you're trying to capture or get a photo of them, it's very difficult because my camera it doesn't focus in 2.4 seconds for some reason. I just use my phone, and by the time I focused on that bee, it's gone. So unless it happens to poke around, a few flowers right in a row beside each other, um, you have a really hard time getting a photo or capturing that bee. And one of the reasons they think that this bee and this is just an example of a specialist bee, can be so effective is that they're specialists on the blueberries. And so they have really learned how to optimize getting pollen from that flower. Whereas bumblebees, which are generalists, they will visit a lot of different types of flowers, including ones that do not require buzz pollination, even though they can do buzz pollination. It's more of a learning curve on how to get the pollen from those flowers. So it takes them more time, and they're not as effective as Anthophora or Habropoda would be. Okay, cruising right along. So how can you help native bees thrive on your cultivated land? And whether that's on your farm, on the garden in your farm, on rangeland, on the little edges of the farm that you're not growing crops on, there's a lot of different things. And basically it comes down to the same thing for all of us. You need food, shelter, water. So let's talk first about nesting sites. Again, about 10% of bees are above ground. And so what this looks like is having, hollow twigs, bee-side tubes. And I'm just going to mention here, my brother said he would never put the leafcutter bees out again where there is a circle, because those, little tubes that are perfect for watering your field are also the perfect size for nesting for leafcutter bees. And you may have a lot of plugged stuff. So these bee-sized tubes, hollow twigs, wood. This is a stump that was out near Ellensburg, and it had holes in it, and there were bees. If you can see right there, there's a mason bee, anosmia, going in, and there was a lot of them going in and out of that. You can put those bee hotels on your property to give them places. Even I found out the siding of my house, there's little holes in the sides of the siding. And I looked out one day and there was a bee that was, making a little nest there and sealing it up with mud. And I was like, okay, that's just improving my insulation, I guess. But they will use whatever is available. But 90% of the bees nest in the ground. So how are we going to support those? One obviously good option is no or low till, where you're not doing those, plowing your field, which I think is, fallen out of use for the most part. But the no till or low till, especially if it's relatively shallow, can help allow the bees that might be in your field to continue to survive. I recognize that's not always viable in everyone's situation, but there are a lot of non-field options. So ditch banks. I grew up in the Columbia Basin. There's ditch banks everywhere. And my new dream is to go, and instead of having them full of weeds, which is what they are right now, basically, is to, get more native plants going out there that would support native pollinators. The other thing is that about a ditch bank is that a lot of bees like to nest in slopes. And so the ditch bank is perfect for that. Driveway edges. In my own driveway here, when we moved here, I found I have a nesting aggregation of, is that my warning? Yes, it is. Okay, keep moving, Karla. Equipment yards, circle corners or field edges, farm lawns and gardens, and rocky or scrub areas. These are all places where native bees that nest in the ground could thrive. The other thing they need is food. Um, do you need variety? It depends upon what bees you have and what you're trying to support. If you have generalist bees that are around all season long, then yeah, you do need to have something blooming all year long, basically, to help support those bees. If you have specialist bees that are only around a certain time, then you may not need to have something in bloom all of the time. Another question I get is, do we want natives or cultivars? And the answer is yes. We want anything in bloom will help native bees. There are some bees that are specialized on certain native plants, but that is kind of a small percentage. Obviously, another thing that bees need is water, which is usually not hard to come by on a farm. This is Xanthophora bomboides, and they're visiting a stream there. And this is like hundreds of females collecting water. Usually, again, not hard to find on a farm. Another thing to think about is overwintering. If they're wild, easy peasy. You don't really have to do anything. If they're managed, they do require some intervention and attention. Oh, okay, I'm gonna have to speed it up.
You still have like 8-9 minutes, so you're good.
Okay, all right. I still have a lot to cover. So cuckoo bees are technically a bee pest, but they're also a sign of a healthy wild bee population. And so these are bees that will go in and sneak into the nests of other bees and lay their eggs, basically. That's the short and dirty version. A parasitic wasp, this again is on my own mason bees. I thought this was a great, I was like, oh, look at this cool wasp I found. I posted on iNaturalist and somebody was like, that is a mason bee pests of mason bees, and they should be squished. So things to look for. Mites. There are bees that have basically symbiotic relationships with mites and have even have physical structures on their bodies to maintain or to carry mites. This is not an example of that. This is an example of poor mason bee management. I've never seen one this bad. It's this poor mason bee is completely covered in mites, and that is not good for the health of the mason bee. There's also chalk brood that can be an issue, and one of the newer pests to Washington State, Houdini fly. This is a pest of mason bees. They again, like the cuckoo bees, will lay their eggs in the nest of the mason bees. The Houdini fly hatches out earlier, consumes the pollen, so there's no resources for the mason bee. And then the reason why it's called the Houdini fly is because to get out and to break through that mud cell wall, it inflates its own head to like break the wall. It is crazy, and it's also extremely hard to control and spreading on the West Coast, really. Okay, let's talk briefly about bees and pesticides. Obviously, follow the label. That's the number one thing. Many labels are now have honeybee considerations on them. However, I will say the impacts to native bees have generally not been studied for pesticide use. So keeping that in mind, think beyond the label. If you're trying to support honeybees, understand how your product works, or ask questions from WSU or the product manufacturer. If you're spraying something on the ground that impacts the larval state of all insects, that is very likely going to impact native bees in the ground. So keeping that in mind. And of course, best practice, reduce pesticide use when you can. Use as targeted of a pesticide as you can to limit off-target impacts. Okay, how did I get into all of this in the first place? Well, you can blame the Washington Bee Atlas, which is a new project with the Washington State Department of Agriculture. I actually do the communications for the project, and that's how I found out about it. But now I'm like a crazy volunteer for them as well. What it does is it trains volunteers, they get certified to go out and collect native bees and document also the host plants that they are on. Those bees are then pinned to museum quality and turned into the WSDA pollinator taxonomists, who will identify those bees to species, which, as I mentioned before, is very difficult, even when you have a pinned specimen for a lot of these bees. And then eventually the data is made public, and you can actually find some of this already on Ecdysis, but we are working on additional tools that will make it more visual and user-friendly for people to get the data about what bees are where and the host plants that they're using. Right now, the Bee Atlas is really just trying to set a baseline for the current status of bees in Washington State. We have it's never been done on a statewide basis. So there's been, bee surveys here, bee surveys there. Most of them are fairly old, and nothing has been done on a statewide level to try and document and find what bees we have. So that's what all these 150 some volunteers at this point. It's a super fast growing program. Last year in July, we announced 25 new and rare bee species. So I can't remember exactly how many were new, but I think it was around half and half. Half were new species that when I say new, I mean not like newly discovered, never seen before species, but new to our state. They've never been detected in our state before. So we found, about half of that number was species that had never been detected in our state before, and about half had not been seen in decades. And preview coming up later this month. About the middle of the month, we're going to be announcing more than, in addition to what we had last year, already 30 new and rare bees, of which I think 18 have never been detected in the state before. So this is pretty exciting. Watch for that press release. Please share it. And this is a picture of me with my bee collection from last year. I collected over 3,000 bees. That was a lot. That was a lot to pin and sort and try and identify, but it was really interesting. So one thing I definitely want to plug is that we are launching right now. This is the brand new, first ever heard publicly, on-farm native bee surveys. So if you want to find out what bees are on your farm, which is really important information to know, so you can support those if you want to support native bees, we want to help you do that. And what you'll do is you sign up for this project. The list of people who sign up will be provided to only our certified volunteers who all have background checks. Gonna note that. And then the volunteers will reach out to these farms. We can't promise that your farm is going to be reached out to, but you'll be on the list of available farms. The volunteers will reach out to farms. They will contact you to arrange, agreed upon times when they can go out and collect. They will go out and collect and then do just our normal process that I mentioned before. They collect them, they label them, they pin them, and they get sent to WSDA for identification, and all of that data will be made public. So if you are interested in participating in that, I will put a link in the chat later because I can't access the chat at the moment, but you can also scan that QR code, and we can potentially send something out after the survey as well, after the presentation as well. Another way that you can participate is we just created a new Native Bees on Farms project on iNaturalist. So this involves taking a photo of bees on your farms. You upload it. There's two different ways. You can upload it on the website itself, iNaturalist.org, or there are apps for both Android and Apple phones where you can take these photos and upload them. You can then add the observation to the Native Bees on Farms project in iNaturalist. And if you need help knowing how to do that, let me know. And just qualifications, it has to be on or directly adjacent to agricultural land. Again, we talked about rangeland farms, farm gardens, anything like that. And please, no honeybees. This is supposed to be about native bees. So basically, for the purposes of this project, anything except the honeybee. I want to provide you some resources. On the left, we have some links. We've got our pollinators page, which is for both honeybees and native bees. If you really want to learn more about native bees specifically, I recommend our native bees short URL, which will go to a site we have that gives kind of a brief overview of a lot of native bees like I went over today. There's also a publication there that you can print and download. We do have some available. But they're usually reserved for like our outreach events and that kind of thing. But reach out to us if you would like one of those. There's OSU publications and WSU publications. And then if you're really into bee photography, Washington Native Bee Society is a great organization to join as well. And then as far as books, we've got, I've sort of put these on here in order of difficulty. So the Bees in Your Backyard is like your basic introduction. I just, want the basics about what bees are in my yard and helping start to get an idea of what the different bees look like. Common Bees of Western North America is sort of a middle road. It's definitely going to have a lot more information or detailed information than the Bees in Your Backyard, especially on identifying some of the more common bees you might find. And then the solitary bees is where my source for a lot of the information I had about the data of bees working on farms. And but this is a textbook. It's heavy, and if you're not don't have an entomology background, it's a lot. But there's some resources for you, and I just wanted to highlight too, I know some of the case studies that I mentioned are not from the Western US, and there is not a lot. Part of that is because I got it all from Solitary Bees book. And part of it is I did do a kind of like a quick dive to look, and there's not a lot of great information that I could easily find on native bee pollination in the Western US. There just has been way more bee work out east where they have actually a lot fewer bees than there has been out west. And so that's one of the things that we're trying to work through with the Washington Bee Atlas. So now it's time for questions, I think. Do we have time? 2 minutes?
Awesome. So we do have time for questions, but I'm going to go ahead and actually take over sharing the screen because it is time for our next code word. So as we answer questions, your code word is on the screen. Please follow the link in the chat box to access the form, enter your code word and your licensing information. We have about 2 minutes before we'll switch it over to Jessica, though, so I think we have time for maybe a question or two. There was a comment that there was the best bee presentation that they've ever attended. And then there was a question about the video. Can the video with the grower, with the cougar cap on discussing be found anywhere online?
Yes, that video, and I wanted to give a special shout out, so thanks. So Washington Grown has a ton of great videos. Really encourage you looking them up. But if you just type in like Washington Grown Alkali Bee on YouTube, you can find that video. It should probably be the first one that pops up. Actually, I'll find it and put the link in the chat too once we're done here. Cassie, you're muted.
The next question that I saw come through, is there any info on early Russian honeybee imports into the Pacific Northwest?
I'm not familiar with that topic. The Russian honeybee would be the same species as Apis mellifera. I mean, it is the same species. It would be a subspecies. So I don't have an answer for that one. Sorry.
Awesome. Again, thanks, Karla. That was a great presentation. Again, the link to the code word is in the chat box. Please click on it and enter the code word native bees along with your information.